Greetings, darlings, and welcome to the very first episode of GassyVampire. I am your host, ArwenStarsong, and here we summon your deepest fears and deep dive into all that is mysterious and macabre. Today, we are covering a nurse who took their experiments a little too far. Someone who got a kick out of making people kick the bucket. Someone who was supposed to save lives, but instead chose to bring death. This is the story of Honora Kelly, aka Jolly Jane. Before we deep dive into our story, if you're a fan of true crime, the paranormal, and anything macabre and creepy, this is the channel for you. Posting here is random at this time, but if you press that notification bell and subscribe, you're gonna open that portal to summon these humble hauntings. Should you sell your soul, you'll make me one happy ghoul. Now let's get into it. Intro! Honora Kelly's childhood was far from what you would picture as a normal one. She was born on March 31st, 1854 to an Irish immigrant family and was one of several children. Before I continue this part of the story, I want to mention a little about the time that they lived in, because during this part of history, Irish immigrants were shunned. No one wanted to hire them, and there would be these big, bold-lettered signs on establishments basically telling the Irish people to get lost. This was also a time period where records were not kept so well, so there was very little details about a lot of this story. So I did my best to pull info from a variety of sources and combine it into what I think would be a much clearer story as to how everything went down. But just remember that during this time period, people hated the Irish for some odd reason, and that during this time, records were lost or never kept well enough for full details, so hearsay was a source of info that was used a lot. Anyways, to continue, her father Peter Kelly was an abusive alcoholic and would usually take his abuse out on Honora and her sister Delia the most. Bridget Kelly, Honora's mother, passed away when she was young from tuberculosis. After this, it was obvious that Peter Kelly was unfit to be a parent for Honora and Delia. More on this later, as this becomes a factor in everything that is about to occur. In 1860, Peter took the girls to the Boston Female Asylum, which was a place where hard-to-handle girls were brought. This was shortly after Bridget died. There are records from the girls' stay at the asylum that stated that the girls were rescued from a miserable home. But there are actually not further records to tell us more, because as I mentioned earlier, this was a time where these types of records were hardly kept and hearsay was more used. We do know, though, that Delia went on to become involved in prostitution, and Honora seemed to be dealt the better opportunity here. During these times, it was common for children from these types of establishments to be taken in by families to become indentured servants. This is what became of Honora. In 1862, she was taken in by a well-to-do family called the Toppans, who had a daughter named Elizabeth who was Honora's age. Honora took their name, and the name Jane, and she and Elizabeth got along well, but she was never really treated as an equal. She was made to do the chores around the house and basically be a servant. Even though the girls were on good terms, something evil was brewing in Jane as she adopted to the new life she was offered. It was said while growing up that Jane Toppan was the life of the party but was a pathological liar. She used her lies to get other children in trouble, and she wove grandiose stories about her life. People just seemed to love her though, so that's good, I guess. It is said that after Jane Toppan graduated high school, she was engaged, but was left at the altar. This event led her down the path to becoming a nurse and also to having trouble with men in general. She started training to become a nurse around 1885 at Cambridge Hospital. It is said that while she worked and trained there, she had to hide her depression and suicidal tendencies. Despite this, she was well liked among her peers, and she earned herself the nickname Jolly Jane. She was also physically strong for a female as well, which really helped her during her nursing career. During the training and her work as a nurse, however, this became a hunting ground for her. She worked with a lot of patients who were elderly, severely ill, or otherwise vulnerable. These patients were apparently her favorites to experiment on. Experiment on, you may ask? Yes. She loved to experiment with different types of poisons on her patients, her two favorites being morphine and atropine. She used injections, teas, and sometimes even enemas to give her patients the poison. Yeah, enemas. The things you... Never mind. She often altered the doses she gave to see the different effects these drugs had on her patients' nervous systems. It was said she would spend a lot of time with her patients, making up fake charts, making them go on roller coasters between conscious and unconscious, and even getting into bed with them and looking into their eyes while they were dying. Jane is said to have been someone who gained perverted sexual pleasure from inflicting pain on others. Gross, right? Ugh. Now, before I continue, it's probably a good idea to mention that back when these things were happening, hospitals were a lot less advanced as they are now. And as I mentioned earlier, records were not really well kept, so the employees and trainees were not really kept track of all too much. Death was very common during these times as well, so they didn't expect anything when Jane's patients would die. In 1889, she was recommended for a job at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she claimed several victims before being fired. Then the following year, she returned to Cambridge, where she once again was fired because she was caught recklessly giving opiate doses. After this, she began her career as a private nurse, and despite complaints of petty theft on a few occasions, this was where she thrived. She was even taking house calls and watching people's children. Now onto the crime spree itself that led to her discovery. It was around 1895 that Jane had begun poisoning her victims. This was the first time she was known to have been linked to the victims she was experimenting on. Her first victims were her landlord Israel Dunham around May 26th, 1895, and his wife Lovely around September 19th, 1897. Then in 1899, her foster sister Elizabeth, now married to a wealthy man named Ornell Brigham, fell ill. Jane insisted on taking care of her and nursing her back to health. But on August 29, 1899, instead of saving her, she overdosed her with strychnine. During this time, she also killed Elizabeth's sister-in-law Edna Bannister in July 19, 1901. Then, in 1901 as well, she moved to live with the Davis family as their private nurse. She was supposed to take care of Mr. Alden Davis after his wife, Mattie, who was killed on July 4, 1901, died. After this, within weeks, she managed to kill Genevieve on July 30th, Alden himself on August 8th, and marry Minnie Gibbs on August 13th of that year. It is said that Minnie's father-in-law saw Jane injecting Minnie's neck, and so he went immediately to the police. He ordered toxicology tests on the bodies of his dead family in hopes of finding the evidence he needed to prove his suspicions correct. Minnie was tested, and sure enough, she was found to have been poisoned, leading to Jane being arrested on October 29, 1901. By 1902, she had confessed to 31 murders. This trial drew a lot of media attention at this time, as no one could imagine that a nurse would go and murder so many of her patients. Her confession was reported in the New York Journal. She apparently insisted that she was sane and knew exactly what she was doing, and that she knew that what she was doing was wrong. The media also reported that she would fondle her patients and look into their eyes as they died, as an attempt to see the inner workings of their souls through their eyes. This was the source of the rumors of her gaining sexual pleasure from her actions of bringing patients near death, then bringing them back to life. Despite on her insistence that she was sane, she was found to be insane, and on July 23, 1902, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to Taunton Insane Hospital until she died. What was her motive though? So it could also be said that she may have done what she did because she genuinely was curious about the scientific aspects of death and the body itself as it dies. Jane was also considered as an angel of mercy, which is a type of killer that becomes a caretaker with the intent of attacking the vulnerable and dependent. For Elizabeth specifically, there was that resentment, the hatred that Jane had felt, seeing her being showered with affection and love and marry a wealthy man, while she herself seemed to have been given a bad hand in life. Jane herself said Elizabeth was the only victim that she truly hated. Her jealousy would lead to her actions of making Elizabeth's death slow, long, and drawn out. Jane also expressed a deep-seated urge to poison. She once poisoned a housekeeper to steal her job. She even went as far as to use poison as a way to evoke sympathy toward herself. She would poison herself on occasion to gain attention from those around her, especially men who courted her. She once also tried to seduce Ornell Brigham, Elizabeth's husband, after Elizabeth had died, but that failed. There is one final factor that maybe led to her actions. It is said the mental history of her family may have led her to becoming a murderer. Her father would succumb to his insanity and drunkenness, earning the nickname Kelly the Crack, as in crackpot, after he once attempted to sew his own eyelids shut while he worked as a tailor. She also had another sister who was later admitted to an insane asylum as well. In conclusion, you never know who you can trust. Sometimes murder wears a smile on its face and can be the most joyful and charming person in the room. And sometimes they can be wearing a uniform to mask their true intentions. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I hope to see you again in the next episode. Again, if true crime and anything weird and macabre is your thing, this is the channel for you. I humbly invite you to press subscribe and summon your deepest fears. It's been a pleasure, guys. I'll see you on the next episode. Hopefully the setup is a lot better the next time. Till then, ta-ta.